The night I almost signed my life away didn't begin with shouting. It began with a perfectly set dinner table, candles straight, plates aligned, glasses polished to the point they reflected faces back at us, distorted, smaller, easier to ignore. Outside, snow pressed gently against the windows like it had all the time in the world. Inside, every breath felt borrowed. My father didn't raise his voice when he slid the folder across the table. He didn't need to. The weight of it did the talking. Thick, neat, prepared. The kind of paperwork that doesn't ask questions. It ends them. "Just sign," he said, like he was asking me to pass the salt. No one reacted. Not my mother, not my relatives, not even my younger brother, who suddenly found the pattern on his plate fascinating. The silence wasn't awkward. It was trained, practiced, polite. The kind of silence that has been rehearsed for years without anyone ever admitting it was a rehearsal. I remember noticing a number before I noticed anything else. $380,000. It stared back at me, clean and unemotional. No context, no apology. Just a number large enough to swallow years of effort, choices, and carefully built independence. Whole. My father leaned back, already confident. My mother adjusted her napkin, already grieving something she'd decided I should lose. Around the table, people waited, not to hear my answer, but to see how quickly I would obey. And in that moment, something snapped quietly inside me. Not rage, not fear. Clarity. Because I realized this wasn't about money. It wasn't even about family. It was about a role I had been playing my entire life without ever agreeing to the script. And the pen, resting inches from my hand, wasn't just a pen. It was a verdict. I arrived at the house an hour before dinner, because that's what I always did. No one asked me to come early. No one thanked me for it either. It was simply understood, like gravity, or the fact that the sun would rise, or that I would somehow end up washing dishes that weren't mine. The front door was unlocked. Of course it was. In this family, boundaries were more of a decorative concept than a real thing. Inside, the house smelled like roasted meat, pine from the Christmas decorations, and something else harder to name. Expectation, maybe, or history. The kind that seeps into walls and makes even renovated rooms feel old. My mother was already in the kitchen, moving efficiently, gracefully, like someone who had mastered the art of being busy enough to avoid uncomfortable conversations. "You're early," she said, not looking up. "I know," I replied, hanging my coat. That was the entire exchange. No hug, no, "How was the drive?" No curiosity about my life outside this house. My arrival wasn't an event, it was a resource showing up on schedule. Within minutes, I was chopping vegetables, setting plates, adjusting chairs. At some point, I realized I'd slipped into motion without consciously deciding to help. My body knew this choreography better than my mind did. Muscle memory, but emotional. My aunt arrived next, then 2 cousins. They greeted my mother warmly, then nodded at me like I was a well-behaved appliance. Functional, reliable, slightly invisible. My younger brother came last, late, loud, and laughing. "Traffic was insane," he announced, as if the universe had personally inconvenienced him. He dropped his jacket on a chair I'd just straightened and immediately went to pour himself a drink. Everyone turned toward him. Smiles bloomed. Energy shifted. My father clapped him on the shoulder. Someone asked about his job. Another asked about his plans for next year. Questions stacked up like gifts waiting to be opened. No one asked me anything. At one point, my aunt leaned toward my mother and said, not quietly, "She's always so helpful." Helpful. Not accomplished, not independent. Helpful. I smiled because that was the appropriate response. Smiling here was like punctuation. You used it to keep sentences from sounding rude. Dinner was announced. We took our seats. I noticed, as I always did, that my place at the table was slightly off-center, closer to the kitchen. Logistical, strategic, convenient. My father cleared his throat, not to speak yet, just to signal ownership of the space. The table quieted immediately. It was impressive in a way, the efficiency of authority. As we began eating, conversation flowed around safe topics: weather, food, someone's new car. I participated just enough to be polite, not enough to draw attention. Years ago, I'd learned that visibility here came with conditions. Halfway through the meal, my father's eyes flicked toward me. "After dinner," he said casually, "we'll talk." He didn't say about what. He didn't need to. The sentence wasn't an invitation, it was a scheduling notice. My fork paused mid-air for a fraction of a second before I forced it back into motion. Around the table, no one reacted. No one asked follow-up questions. Everyone accepted the announcement as normal. Inside, something tightened. I told myself it was nothing. Just family business, just conversation, just another moment where I would listen, nod, and do what was expected. I'd done it before. I could do it again. Still, my appetite faded. As dessert was served, I noticed my father leave the table briefly and return with a thick folder tucked under his arm. He didn't place it down yet. He rested it beside his chair, like a loaded object waiting for the right moment. I watched it the way you watch something you don't want to acknowledge but can't ignore. A quiet part of me was already counting exits, even though I didn't plan to use them. Here's the mildly funny part, though it didn't feel funny at the time. My first irrational thought was that I hoped the paperwork wasn't long. Not that I hoped it wasn't devastating, just not long. As if efficiency would somehow make betrayal easier to digest. That's when I realized how deeply trained I was. Trained to accommodate. Trained to minimize. Trained to measure my own discomfort against everyone else's convenience, and come up short. My father finally slid the folder onto the table, but didn't open it yet. He took a sip of water, slow and deliberate. No one spoke. The silence settled in, heavy but familiar, like an old coat you forget is uncomfortable because you've worn it your whole life. And in that quiet, before a single page was turned, I understood something with absolute clarity. Whatever was in that folder had been decided long before I walked through the door. I wasn't here to negotiate. I was here to perform my role. And the worst part wasn't that they expected me to comply. It was that, for a long time, I had taught them I would. Before that dinner, before the folder, before the number with too many zeros tried to redefine my existence, my life was ordinary. And I mean that in the best possible way. Ordinary meant calm. Ordinary meant I knew what my week looked like. The night before the trip, I was in my apartment, barefoot, standing at my desk with a mug of tea slowly going cold beside my laptop. The city hummed outside my window, cars passing, someone laughing too loudly on the sidewalk, the distant, comforting chaos of other people living lives that had nothing to do with mine. I had spreadsheets open, real ones, deadlines highlighted, a calendar that belonged to me. My phone buzzed with work messages, the kind that annoyed me just enough to feel important. There was a future here, measurable, incremental, boring in a way that felt earned. On my fridge was a sticky note reminding me to call the dentist. Not dramatic, not tragic, just human. Then my phone lit up again. Family group chat. "Christmas dinner, don't be late." No greeting. No question mark. I stared at the message longer than necessary. My thumb hovered over the screen, waiting for a response to appear on its own, as if the phone might sense my hesitation and decide for me. I didn't reply right away. That pause, those few seconds, were small, but they mattered. Because in that gap lived the version of me that wondered, briefly, what would happen if I said no? I told myself I was overthinking it, that I'd just go, eat, smile, leave. A few hours, that's all. I'd done this dance my entire adult life. It's just dinner, I muttered to the empty room. The empty room didn't argue. I packed lightly. No gifts, just my coat and a vague sense of obligation. As I zipped my bag, I felt that familiar internal negotiation begin, the quiet calculation of how much of myself I was willing to spend to keep the peace. If you've ever done that math, you know the answer is never zero. On the drive there, I rehearsed neutral responses in my head, polite deflections, non-committal nods, emotional camouflage. I was very good at emotional camouflage. I should have put it on my resume. Here's something mildly ironic. I genuinely believed I was protecting my independence by keeping the relationship smooth. I thought distance plus compliance equaled safety. As long as I didn't rock the boat wouldn't turn toward me. That belief had worked, until it didn't. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my shoulders were already tight. My jaw ached from clenching without realizing it. My body knew something my mind was still politely ignoring. Inside, as I moved through the house on autopilot, I noticed details that made the place feel unchanged in unsettling ways. The same framed family photos, the same clock ticking too loudly, the same unspoken hierarchy embedded in furniture placement and tone of voice. Nothing here had evolved. I had. And that was the problem. At one point, while setting the table, I caught my reflection in the glass cabinet. For a second, I didn't recognize myself. Not because I looked different, but because I looked split. Half the person I was out there in the world, half the version this house expected me to be. The version that didn't ask questions. The version that absorbed inconvenience like a sponge and called it love. Here's where I'll admit something uncomfortable. Part of me still wanted approval. Not praise, just acknowledgement. You're doing well that didn't come with conditions. That part of me was naive, loyal, stubborn, and very quiet. When my father announced we'd talk after dinner, that quiet part shrank even further. I told myself not to worry. Told myself I was imagining things. Told myself that no one would actually ask me to sacrifice something real. After all, I had a life now, a job, responsibilities. I wasn't the backup plan anymore, right? But the truth was already sitting in the room, waiting in paper form. And if I'm being honest, painfully honest, there was a moment that night, long before the folder touched the table, where I knew exactly why I'd been summoned. I just didn't want to say it out loud. Because naming the pattern makes it harder to pretend you're not part of it. Here's a small, darkly funny thought that crossed my mind as I refilled water glasses for everyone else. I wondered if there was a loyalty punch card I was one stamp away from completing. Like, congratulations! One more sacrifice and the next one is free. That's the thing about families like this. They don't demand everything at once. They take it in reasonable pieces. They make each ask feel isolated, temporary, necessary. Until one day, the sum total shows up with a cover page, and you realize your quiet compliance didn't protect your life at all. It marked it. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. If you were watching this unfold from the outside, would you have convinced yourself it was just family stuff? Or would something in your gut have told you this was heading somewhere dangerous? I'm genuinely curious. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every one, and sometimes your perspective catches things even I missed back then. By the time dessert plates were cleared, the air felt thinner. The folder was still closed, but its presence dominated the table like a guest no one wanted to acknowledge. I sat there, hands folded, spine straight, performing calm. What I didn't know yet was that this calm wasn't the beginning of surrender. It was the last moment before I stopped lying to myself about why I was there. If roles in my family came with job descriptions, mine would have been laminated years ago and taped to the fridge. Position, the reliable one. Responsibilities, fix problems quietly, absorb tension gracefully, Never, under any circumstances, become the problem. The thing is, I don't remember ever applying. It started the moment I stepped fully into the house that night. Not when I sat down, not when the folder appeared. Earlier than that. Earlier than anyone would admit. "Can you help in the kitchen?" my mother asked, already knowing the answer. I nodded because nodding was faster than thinking. Within minutes, I was moving between counters and cabinets, refilling trays, adjusting things that didn't need adjusting. No one asked if I was tired from the drive. No one asked how work was going. My presence was immediately converted into usefulness. My brother wandered in late, as usual, phone still in his hand. "Hey," he said cheerfully, grabbing a piece of food before dinner was officially announced. My mother smiled at him in a way she hadn't smiled at me all evening. "You hungry?" she asked. I almost laughed. Almost. The contrast was so obvious it bordered on parody. If this were a sitcom, a laugh track would have kicked in right there. Instead, there was just me, rearranging napkins that were already perfectly arranged. At the table, the pattern continued. My brother talked about his plans, big ideas, vague timelines, confidence without specifics. Everyone leaned in. Encouragement flew freely. My father nodded approvingly, interrupting only to add helpful suggestions. When I mentioned a recent project at work, the conversation politely drifted elsewhere within seconds. No hostility, no dismissal, just redirection. Like my accomplishments were background noise. Pleasant, but unnecessary to focus on. At one point, my aunt chuckled and said, "She's always been so responsible." Everyone agreed. Responsible. That word landed heavier than it should have, because in this family, responsible didn't mean capable. It meant available. It meant you didn't get to be reckless or lost or unsure. It meant you didn't get to fail publicly. You were the safety net, and safety nets don't get applause. They get stepped on. As dinner progressed, I noticed how decisions were made. My father spoke, others adjusted. My mother softened the edges. My brother benefited from the outcome. And I accommodated. This wasn't cruelty. That's what made it harder to name. No one was yelling. No one was overtly unkind. Everything happened under the guise of reasonableness, which is far more dangerous. Here's something I didn't fully understand until much later. Families like this don't need villains. They need systems. And once you're assigned a role within that system, you're expected to perform it flawlessly. Silence is praised. Compliance is rewarded. Resistance is treated as betrayal. When my father glanced at me across the table and said, "You're good with details," it sounded like a compliment. It wasn't. It was a setup. Because when people call you good with details, what they usually mean is, you'll handle the parts we don't want to deal with. I felt it then, a faint tightening in my chest, the sense that the evening was drifting towards something pre-planned, like a play where everyone but me had already attended rehearsal. I tried to ground myself, focus on physical sensations, the weight of the chair, the texture of the tablecloth, the clink of silverware, normal things. But the longer the meal went on, the more I noticed the subtle choreography happening around me. People exchanging looks, conversations stalling, then restarting. My father checking the time. The folder still beside his chair, unopened but never forgotten. I wanted to ask what this was really about. I didn't, because asking questions had never been part of my role. Instead, I waited. Waiting was something I'd been trained to do very well. As dessert plates were passed around, my brother leaned back comfortably, scrolling on his phone. Someone joked about him always being carefree. Laughter followed. I smiled automatically. Inside, a different realization began to form. Slow, unwelcome, undeniable. They weren't just asking me to help tonight. They were counting on me. Counting on my predictability. counting on my reluctance to disrupt, counting on the fact that I'd been smoothing over discomfort since I was old enough to understand what discomfort was. And the most unsettling part? They weren't wrong to count on it. Not yet. Here's a small, grimly humorous truth I can admit now. If my life had been a board game, I was the square everyone landed on when they needed extra cash. Collect resources from responsible daughter. No dice roll required. When my father finally said, "Let's finish eating," in a tone that meant the opposite, the room shifted. Forks slowed. Conversations died out mid-sentence. I felt my stomach drop. Not from fear exactly, but from recognition. This was the moment the role stopped being implied and started being enforced. And for the first time that night, I wondered, not vaguely, not hypothetically, but clearly, what would happen if I didn't play along? The thought was terrifying. Not because I didn't know how they'd react, but because I did. I straightened in my chair, folded my hands, and waited for whatever came next. The folder hadn't opened yet, but everyone already knew why it was there, including me. The first time I signed something for my family, it didn't feel dramatic. That's important. No raised voices, no ultimatum, no folder slammed onto a table. Just a single sheet of paper, thin enough to look harmless, placed in front of me like an afterthought. I was younger then, still living close enough to home that dropping by didn't require planning or excuses. I remember the light in the room, afternoon sun cutting through half-closed curtains, dust floating lazily like it had nowhere better to be. My mother stood beside me, not in front of me, beside, close enough that I could smell her perfume, the familiar one she always wore to signal calm. "This is just a formality," she said softly. Just, that word again. She didn't rush me, she didn't threaten. She smiled, the kind of smile that suggests maturity, teamwork, us against the world. "Your father already handled most of it," she continued. "We just need your signature so everything stays smooth." Smooth, another favorite. I scanned the page briefly. Legal language. Dense, boring, intimidating in that quiet way that makes you feel stupid for not understanding it immediately. "What is it exactly?" I asked. She placed her hand lightly on my shoulder, a reassuring weight. "It's nothing bad," she said. "Just one of those things adults have to deal with." I was an adult, technically, but not the kind who felt entitled to question paperwork placed in front of her by family. Not yet. "It's just this once," she added. "You know how things are right now." That phrase, "you know how things are," was the emotional equivalent of duct tape. It patched over explanations. It justified urgency. It implied shared responsibility without ever stating facts. I hesitated. Not long. Just enough for her to notice. She squeezed my shoulder gently. "Don't worry," she said. "We wouldn't ask if it wasn't necessary." And there it was, the unspoken rule. If you're being asked, it must already be justified. If it's necessary, resistance is selfish. If you hesitate, you're the problem, not the request. I signed. No ceremony, no inner rebellion, just ink on paper and a quiet sense of relief that I'd helped. Nothing exploded afterward, no immediate consequences. In fact, things got calmer. Problems that had been buzzing in the background seemed to settle. My parents were less stressed. The house felt lighter. That was the reward. Silence. Peace. And my brain logged it carefully. Sacrifice equals stability. Compliance equals love. Over time, that one signature became invisible, absorbed into the family narrative like it had always been there. No one mentioned it again. I didn't either. But something subtle changed. The next time a favor was needed, it came faster, more casually, as if precedent had been established. "You handled it so well last time," You're better at these things. You don't mind, right? And I didn't. Not because I wanted to give more, because I didn't yet know how to stop. Years passed. That just once stretched quietly into a pattern. Not constant, not obvious, just enough to shape expectations. I noticed it when conversation shifted mid-sentence once I entered the room. When decisions seemed half-made already, waiting only for my confirmation. When problems landed in my lap fully formed, like someone had outsourced accountability. Still, no one called it that. They called it trust. I told myself I was choosing this, that being dependable was a strength, that my willingness to shoulder responsibility meant I was strong enough to carry it. Here's the part that stings to admit. I was proud of it. Proud of being the one who could handle things. Proud of being needed. Proud of being the adult when others didn't feel like stepping up. If you'd asked me back then whether I felt used, I would have laughed. Used? No. I was valued. At least, that's what it felt like. In hindsight, the humor of it is almost cruel. I was like someone who volunteers to hold a door open, then slowly realizes they're now responsible for the entire building's entrance policy. People just kept walking through. I remember one moment in particular, years after that first signature. My father casually mentioned, "You're good under pressure." In the same tone someone might say, "You're tall." A fact, a utility. I smiled. Inside, something shifted, but not enough to stop me. That's the thing about early conditioning. It doesn't feel like conditioning. It feels like character. By the time I learned to recognize the cost, the role was already assigned, the script already written. So when that folder appeared on the table years later, heavy with consequences, it wasn't a new request. It was the logical conclusion of a story that had started with a single page, a soft voice, and the promise that it would only be this once. I didn't know then what I know now, that the most dangerous agreements aren't the ones forced on you. They're the ones you enter willingly, because you've been taught that love sounds like obligation, and that saying no is a kind of harm. And once you accept that lesson, the paper doesn't even need to be explained anymore. It just needs to be signed. There's a lie families like mine tell themselves, and it goes like this. No one is forcing anything. They say it proudly, as if the absence of shouting automatically means the presence of consent. At that table, before a single page was turned, I finally understood how that lie works. My father didn't need to dominate the room the way people imagine domination. He didn't need volume. He had position. History. The kind of authority that doesn't argue because it doesn't expect resistance. When he spoke, he didn't look at me right away. That detail mattered. His gaze drifted first, briefly, almost casually, toward my brother. Just a flicker, a check-in. Then his eyes settled on the folder. Only after that did he look at me. It was subtle. Anyone else might have missed it. I didn't. Because that glance answered a question no one was brave enough to ask out loud. Who is this really for? My mother cleared her throat softly, the sound she made when she was about to make something uncomfortable sound reasonable. We're just talking, she said. No one's saying anything has to happen tonight. That was technically true, and completely false. Around the table my relatives shifted in their chairs. Forks paused. Glasses were lifted, then set down untouched. Everyone suddenly found the tablecloth fascinating. This is where the idea of sides becomes misleading. There were no sides here. There was gravity. And gravity always pulled in the same direction. No one spoke up. Not because they didn't understand what was happening, but because understanding didn't obligate them to intervene. Silence allowed everyone to remain innocent, neutral, clean. I used to think neutrality meant fairness. I was wrong. Neutrality in rooms like this is just consent without fingerprints. My aunt smiled at me in that sympathetic way people do when they're relieved they're not you. "You've always been so level-headed," she said gently. "You'll know what to do." There it was again. You'll know what to do. Translated, you'll do what you always do. My brother avoided my eyes completely now. He stared at his plate, jaw tight, shoulders tense. Not with guilt exactly, but with discomfort. The discomfort of someone who knows a storm is passing overhead and is very invested in not being struck by lightning. I don't blame him for that. Not fully. He'd grown up on the other side of the equation, where mistakes were problems to be managed, not identities to be worn, where questions were invitations, not threats. My father finally spoke again. "This isn't complicated," he said, tapping the folder once with his finger, not opening it, just tapping, like a judge signaling for order. "We need everyone to be reasonable." Reasonable. The word landed like a net. Reasonable people don't make scenes. Reasonable people don't air private matters. Reasonable people don't say no without a better alternative. I looked around the table. Every face I saw carried a version of the same expression: expectation without responsibility. They weren't asking if I would help. They were waiting how I would justify it to myself. And suddenly, something inside me shifted. Not into anger, but into awareness. This wasn't a family discussion. It was a delegation. My role wasn't to decide, it was to absorb. Here's the quiet, bitter humor of it all. If I'd flipped the table and screamed, I would have been labeled emotional, unstable, unreasonable. If I calmly refused, I would have been labeled cold, ungrateful, difficult. There was no version of no that didn't make me the villain. That's how these systems protect themselves. They don't block exits, they redefine them as betrayals. My mother leaned closer to me then, her voice lower. "You understand how much pressure your father's under," she said. "This would help him so much." Help him. Not help us. Not solve the issue. Help him. And just like that, the responsibility shifted again. Not just onto my shoulders, but into my conscience. If something went wrong after this, it wouldn't be because the plan was flawed. It would be because I hadn't been supportive enough. I realized then that no one at this table was neutral. Not really. They were aligned, not necessarily with my father, but with the system that kept their own lives undisturbed. Conflict avoidance has a cost, and in my family, that cost had my name on it. I took a slow breath, the kind that looks calm on the outside and feels like bracing for impact on the inside. For the first time that evening, I didn't feel small. I felt boxed in. And that distinction mattered, because smallness implies weakness. This wasn't weakness. This was architecture, built carefully, maintained collectively, designed to funnel pressure toward the person most likely to hold it without breaking. Me. The folder was still closed. No number spoken, no details revealed. Yet somehow, everyone already knew the ending they were hoping for. All except me. Because sitting there, watching silence masquerade as fairness, I finally understood something that took me years to name. In families like this, power doesn't shout. It waits. And the longer you stay quiet, the more it assumes you're listening. I didn't say anything yet, but for the first time in my life, my silence wasn't agreement. It was observation. And that changed everything. I asked to speak privately. Not dramatically, not loudly. Just a simple, measured request, delivered in the same tone someone might use to ask where the extra napkins were kept. "Can we talk for a minute?" I said, looking at my father. The room paused. Not stopped, paused, like a video buffering at a bad moment. My father didn't answer right away. He glanced at the table, at the half-eaten dessert, at the relatives who were suddenly very invested in their forks. "After we finish eating," he said, "let's not ruin the meal." There it was. The unspoken rule, spoken clearly. The meal must survive. Not the relationship. Not the truth. Not me. The meal. I nodded and sat back, because pushing would have made me the problem. And everyone at that table knew it, including me. Dinner resumed, technically. People chewed. Someone commented on the dessert being a little too sweet. Another person laughed a beat too late at a joke that hadn't landed. I lowered myself back into my chair and placed my hands in my lap, fingers interlaced tightly enough to feel my pulse. On the table, the folder sat between dishes like a foreign object no one wanted to acknowledge. It wasn't centered. It didn't need to be. Its gravity bent the space around it. I tried to eat. I really did. I even managed a few bites. They tasted like nothing. As conversation limped forward, I started noticing details I hadn't before. Not because they were new, but because I was finally paying attention. The folder wasn't just thick. It was marked. Tabs, underlines, notes in different handwriting. This wasn't a last-minute request. It was a plan. Prepared, reviewed, refined. Someone had spent time on this. Time I hadn't been invited into. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not peace, but clarity. The kind that arises when denial runs out of places to hide. Here's a thought that drifted through my head, uninvited but oddly grounding. My family has turned dinner into a meeting without minutes. The absurdity almost made me smile. Almost. My father checked his watch. My mother adjusted her posture. A few relatives shifted in their chairs, like people sensing a storm but hoping it would pass quickly. I realized then that the delay wasn't for my benefit. It was strategic. Eating bought time. Time for pressure to build. Time for me to sit with discomfort long enough that compliance would feel like relief. This wasn't confrontation avoidance. It was conditioning. The more I sat there, the more my body reacted. My shoulders tightened. My jaw clenched. My fingers went numb, then cold. My heart beat faster. Not panicked, just alert. Like it knew something important was coming and wanted me ready. No one noticed. Or maybe they did, and chose not to. At one point, my uncle cleared his throat and said, "Everything okay?" He didn't look at me when he said it. "Yes," my mother answered immediately. "We're just talking." Talking. Another word doing heavy labor. I looked around the table and wondered, briefly, quietly, what it would be like to stand up and leave. Just grab my coat and go. No explanation, no argument. The image was tempting. But I knew what would follow. Phone calls, messages, reframed narratives. She left in a huff. She couldn't handle a simple discussion. We were just trying to help. Leaving wouldn't end the story. It would just let them finish telling it without me. So I stayed. Here's the darkly funny part. Somewhere between the third polite comment about the dessert and my father's second glance at the folder, I realized that my presence was doing more emotional labor than anyone else's words. I was holding the tension, so they didn't have to. That was my role, after all. My brother shifted uncomfortably, finally glancing at me for the first time in minutes. Our eyes met briefly. In his expression, I didn't see malice. I saw relief mixed with dread. Relief that the spotlight wasn't on him. Dread that it might be soon. He looked away. I didn't blame him, but I noted it. When the plates were cleared, my father finally straightened his back. "All right," he said. "Let's get to it." The words landed like a gavel. My stomach dropped, not because I was afraid of what was coming, but because I knew the waiting was over. The performance phase was ending. The assignment phase was beginning. The folder was pulled closer to the center of the table. This time, no one pretended not to see it. My father didn't open it yet. He placed his hand on top of it, palm flat, claiming it, possessing it, controlling the pace. He looked around the table once, quick, efficient, then at me. "Family needs you," he said. "Not we need help, not we have a problem. Family needs you." It was framed as honor, duty, inevitability. I didn't respond. And for the first time, that silence felt different. Not submissive, measured, intentional. Because somewhere between asking to speak privately and being told not to ruin the meal, something fundamental had shifted inside me. I was no longer trying to keep the dinner intact. I was trying to keep myself intact. And those two goals, I was beginning to realize, were not compatible. My father didn't ease into it. Once he decided the moment had arrived, he went straight for certainty, the kind that leaves no room for interpretation. He opened the folder. The sound was sharper than it should have been. Paper against paper, a quiet snap that cut through the room and silenced the last scraps of small talk. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether it was allowed to keep ticking. He didn't slide the pages toward me yet. Instead, he began to speak. Slowly, deliberately, like a man reciting facts he believed had already been proven. "You've always stepped up," he said, eyes fixed somewhere between my face and the document. "Every time this family needed stability, you were there." He paused, just long enough for the words to sink in. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not pride, not gratitude. Recognition. This wasn't praise, this was inventory. "You were the one who postponed school," he continued. "The one who signed when things got complicated. The one who made sure bills were paid on time so nobody lost face." Each sentence landed like a stamp on an invisible ledger. He was counting. And with every item listed, the room seemed to lean subtly in his direction, as if the air itself agreed with his math. I looked around the table. No one interrupted. No one corrected him. No one said, "That wasn't her responsibility." My father's voice grew firmer. "You didn't complain then," he said. "You understood what was at stake." Understood. That word carried a quiet threat. If I had understood before, then refusing now would mean I suddenly didn't. Or worse, that I was pretending not to. He tapped the folder lightly. "This is no different." It was, but I didn't say that yet. Instead, he went further. "All those choices you made," he said, leaning back slightly. "They're the reason things turned out all right. For all of us." For all of us. The implication was clear. Whatever I had now, my job, my independence, my life, it existed because the family had allowed it. And allowances, apparently, could be revoked. "You didn't lose anything," he added, almost kindly. "You just adjusted." Adjusted. I felt my hands go cold. This was the pivot point, the moment where sacrifice stopped being framed as generosity and started being reframed as obligation. Because once something is expected, refusing it becomes theft. My father leaned forward again, this time placing his palm flat on the open page. "Let's be clear," he said. "You didn't do those things for nothing. You did them because you're part of this family." There it was, the trap closing. "You live the life you live now because this family stood behind you," he continued. "Without us, what would you be?" The question wasn't rhetorical. It was erasure. I felt a ringing in my ears, sudden and disorienting. The edges of the room blurred slightly, like someone had turned down the contrast on reality. Without us, what would you be? I wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity hit all at once. I had paid my own rent for years, built my career from the ground up, made choices alone, carried consequences alone, failed and recovered alone. And yet here I was, being told my existence was alone. Here's the cruel humor of it. When someone redefines your entire life as a favor they granted you, they can ask for anything in return and call it balance. My father's voice sharpened. "You think you got here by yourself?" he said. The room went very quiet. My heart was pounding now, not racing but heavy, deliberate, like it was counting too. I noticed my mother's hands folded tightly in her lap, my brother's foot bouncing under the table, nervous energy with nowhere to go. My relatives staring everywhere except at me. No one challenged him. Silence thickened. Then came the sentence that changed something fundamental inside me. "You owe this family," my father said, "and now it's time to pay it back." There it was. Not help, not support, debt. Years of quiet endurance, reframed as something I now had to repay, with interest. My vision tunneled briefly. The room felt too small, the air too thin. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just sat there, absorbing the reality of what was happening. My sacrifices, every delayed dream, every absorbed consequence, every time I stepped aside, hadn't earned me respect. They had trained them to see my limits as flexible, trained them to believe my future was negotiable. My father wasn't angry. That was the most chilling part. He was certain that I would comply, certain that history would repeat itself, certain that this was just the next logical step. He slid the page toward me at last. Numbers were visible now. Clauses. Dense blocks of text designed to overwhelm, not inform. The figure sat there, bold and unapologetic. $380,000. The room held its breath. My father spoke again, quieter now. "This is what family does," he said. "We don't abandon each other." Abandon. As if refusing to be consumed was the same as leaving someone to die. Something inside me went very still. The noise in my head faded. The ringing stopped. The panic receded. In its place was a cold, sharp clarity. This wasn't about money. It was about control. About rewriting my past to justify owning my future. And for the first time, I understood something that hurt far more than the accusation of debt. They genuinely believed this logic made sense. They believed love could be quantified. That sacrifice, once given, belonged to them forever. That I was not a person who had helped, but a resource that had finally come due. I didn't reach for the pen. I didn't push the paper away either. I simply sat there, hands still, eyes steady, letting the weight of his words settle completely. Because I needed them to finish. I needed to hear everything. Only then would I know exactly what I was standing up against. When my mother finally spoke, the room changed in a way my father never could have achieved alone. He used force. She used reason. And reason, when weaponized, cuts cleaner. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt him sharply or challenge his framing. Instead, she reached out and gently adjusted the collar of my sweater, right there at the table, in front of everyone. An intimate gesture that would have looked loving to an outsider. It felt like being repositioned. "Honey," she said softly, "no one is attacking you." That sentence landed heavier than anything my father had said. Because suddenly, the problem wasn't the demand, it was my reaction to it. She turned slightly toward the rest of the table, as if inviting them into her calm. "We're just trying to handle this as a family," she continued. "There's no need to make it into something it's not." Something it's not. My chest tightened. This was the part where refusal became hysteria, where boundaries became drama, where clarity became cruelty. She looked back at me, eyes warm, steady, almost sad. "You know how much people talk," she said gently. "Everyone's watching how we handle this." There it was, the invisible audience. I felt the weight of it instantly. Not just the people at the table, but the imagined chorus beyond the walls. Relatives, family friends, the future version of this story retold without my voice. If this turns into a conflict, she went on, it won't just affect us. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I heard it anyway. It will affect how you're seen. My father stayed silent now. He didn't need to push anymore. He had passed the baton. My mother leaned closer, lowering her voice. You wouldn't do this to me, she said. Not accusing, not begging, stating it like a fact. And that was the moment I felt something snap. Not loudly, but completely. Because I realized she wasn't asking what I wanted. She was telling me who I was supposed to be. The good daughter doesn't embarrass her parents. The good daughter doesn't say no in public. The good daughter absorbs the cost quietly so everyone else can stay comfortable. I saw it then with brutal clarity. My father needed my compliance. My mother needed my consent. And consent extracted through guilt is still control. She sighed, as if carrying a burden no one else could see. After everything we've done for you, she said, is this really the moment you choose to draw a line? Draw a line, as if I were the one escalating, as if the paper in front of me wasn't already a boundary drawn across my future. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, not tears yet, but pressure. My body reacting faster than my words. She reached for my hand. I didn't pull away. That's important. I let her hold it, because I needed to feel how this worked, needed to understand it fully. Her grip was gentle, anchoring, and utterly inescapable. Here's the strange, almost darkly funny thought that drifted through my head in that moment. If my mother's kindness were a political candidate, it would win by a landslide. No scandals, no aggression, just overwhelming moral superiority. She continued, voice low. Families survive because people make sacrifices, she said. You've always understood that. Understood. Past tense. She was anchoring my future to my history. You're strong, she added. You can handle this. That sentence hit differently. Strength in this family didn't mean resilience. It meant capacity for absorption. The room stayed quiet. No one intervened. No one disagreed. No one said, "This is too much to ask." Their silence pressed in from all sides, shaping the moment, narrowing my options. For the first time, I felt the full force of what moral pressure really is. Not loud, not violent, but relentless. I was being framed as the villain in advance. If I signed, I would be dutiful. If I hesitated, I would be selfish. If I refused, I would be cruel. There was no version of myself left untouched. I placed my free hand flat on the edge of the table, grounding myself. The wood felt solid, real. A small anchor in a moment that threatened to drift into unreality. I took a slow breath, and then I did something unexpected. I said nothing. Not because I was defeated, but because I was listening, really listening, for the first time. Listening not to their words, but to the logic underneath them. And what I heard was this. Your worth is conditional. Your value depends on your silence. Your love is measured by how much you're willing to lose. That was the bargain. I withdrew my hand gently from my mother's grip. She noticed. A flicker crossed her face. Not anger, not fear. Surprise. Because my silence wasn't soft anymore. It was firm. I didn't speak yet, but I met her eyes and held them, steady and unflinching. The room felt different now. Less certain, less scripted. And in that shift, something irreversible happened. Before we go any further, let me ask you this. If you were in my place at that moment, surrounded by calm voices and moral pressure instead of shouting, would you have stayed silent to keep the peace? Or would you have pushed back, knowing exactly what it might cost. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. My mother leaned back slowly. My father's jaw tightened. The table, once so orderly, felt unstable. Because they could sense it now. The silence they were used to, the silence that meant compliance, had changed its meaning. And they didn't yet know what that meant for them, but they were about to find out. There's a reason I didn't panic when the folder hit the table. I didn't understand that reason fully at the time. I only felt its effect. A strange steadiness under the pressure, like a hidden beam holding up a collapsing structure. That steadiness came from something I had done years earlier. Quietly, carefully, alone. It started on a weekday afternoon that had nothing dramatic about it. No arguments, no crises, just a lingering discomfort that wouldn't leave me alone after yet another small favor wrapped in vague language and moral reassurance. I remember sitting at my desk, staring at an old document I'd dug out of a drawer. The paper was slightly yellowed at the edges, folded and unfolded so many times it no longer lay flat. The signature at the bottom, mine, looked younger somehow, less certain, like it belonged to a version of me that still believed clarity was optional. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. I just knew I didn't feel safe not knowing. So I did something that felt almost rebellious at the time. I asked a lawyer to look at it. Not my family's lawyer, not a friend of a friend. Someone neutral, boring, thorough, the kind of person who reads contracts the way surgeons read scans. I remember sitting across from him, palms damp, explaining the situation in the most generous terms possible. I softened everything, downplayed urgency, framed it as curiosity. He listened without interrupting, eyes on the page, pen moving occasionally. Minutes passed. Then he looked up. "You're not responsible for this," he said. I blinked. "What?" He tapped a section halfway down the page. "This clause here, and this one, and this." He turned the document slightly so I could see. "This signature doesn't do what you think it does," he continued. "You agreed to be present, to acknowledge, not to assume liability." I felt a strange mix of relief and embarrassment. "So, I'm not on the hook?" He shook his head. "No, not legally." Legally, that word echoed, because suddenly a fog I hadn't known was there began to lift. All those years, all that pressure, all those implications of debt and obligation. They hadn't been legal truths, they'd been narratives, carefully maintained, repeated until they felt like facts. "Why would they say I was responsible then?" I asked. The lawyer paused. Not long, just enough. "Because you acted like you were," he said. That sentence stayed with me. I didn't confront anyone afterward. I didn't announce what I'd learned. I didn't even change my behavior much. Not yet. I just made copies. One for a folder, one for a cloud drive, one I kept folded in the back of a drawer I rarely opened. I told myself it was insurance. I told myself I hoped I'd never need it. And then life went on. Years passed. The requests continued, never identical, never quite crossing a line that could be pointed to cleanly, always just close enough to make me doubt myself. But something had changed. I stopped internalizing the guilt quite so deeply. I stopped assuming I was ignorant just because I hadn't been informed. I began to notice how often urgency replaced explanation. I didn't become confrontational, I became observant. That distinction matters. So when my father recited my sacrifices like entries on a balance sheet, something in me recognized the pattern, not as truth, but as strategy. When my mother framed compliance as kindness, I heard the echo of past conversations where clarity had been deliberately avoided. And when the number appeared, $380,000, bold and final, I didn't feel confusion. I felt confirmation. They were doing it again, just bigger. Here's a quiet, slightly absurd thought I had as my father's finger hovered over the page. They really should have checked what I knew before escalating. Not smug, not vengeful, just factual. The irony is, I hadn't kept that document because I planned to use it against them. I'd kept it because, on some level, I knew the truth mattered, even if no one else wanted it to. I looked at the folder in front of me now, thicker, more aggressive, dressed up with tabs and annotations, prepared. But preparation without consent is just assumption, and assumption is fragile. I didn't reach into my bag. I didn't pull anything out. I didn't announce that I knew something they didn't. That would have turned this into a debate. I didn't need a debate. I needed timing. So I sat there, listening, watching my father's certainty settle into the room like a permanent fixture, watching my mother's calm calcify into expectation, watching my brother disappear into himself. And underneath it all, I felt that hidden beam again. The quiet strength of knowing the ground was firmer beneath me than they believed. The past version of me, the one who signed without reading, had trusted love to protect her. The present version of me trusted information. And information doesn't argue. It waits. As my father slid the contract fully in front of me at last, pen following close behind, I felt a strange, almost solemn gratitude for that afternoon years ago. For the lawyer's neutrality, for the boring clarity of legal language, for the version of me who'd been just uncertain enough to ask a question. Because now, sitting at that table, surrounded by certainty that wasn't earned, I wasn't guessing anymore. I knew exactly where I stood. And more importantly, I knew where I didn't. When the pen finally slid across the table toward me, it didn't feel dramatic. It felt procedural, like a step everyone had rehearsed internally so many times that the outcome already lived in their bodies. My father's hand lingered near the pen for half a second longer than necessary, a quiet assertion of ownership before he released it. There you go. Your turn. The room held its breath. I didn't reach for it immediately, not out of defiance, not to make a point. I just needed one more second to notice everything. My mother exhaled softly, like she was already preparing for relief. My brother's shoulders dropped a fraction, the way they do when a storm you didn't cause finally starts moving away from you. Around the table, people leaned back just slightly, subtle, unconscious movements that said this is resolving. They believed the hardest part was over. I asked for the original copy. My father nodded once and flipped the folder, efficient, satisfied. He handed it to me without hesitation. That alone told me a lot. People who are bluffing hesitate. People who believe they're in control do not. I took the document and scanned it quickly. Not line by line, not theatrically, just enough to confirm what I already suspected. Dense language, legal framing designed to intimidate. The kind of contract that counts on urgency doing most of the work. I paused, long enough for discomfort to creep back into the room. My mother shifted in her chair. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. I looked up and met her eyes. "Yes," I said, and meant it. I read a little more, then I stopped. I looked at my father. Then, without saying anything, I picked up the pen. The reaction was immediate. Relief moved through the table like a wave. Not joy, not gratitude. Release. My mother's shoulders relaxed. My father leaned back slightly, already disengaging. My brother stared at his plate, not looking up, like someone who knows the credits are about to roll and doesn't want to see the final scene. In that moment, I saw exactly how this story would be told afterward. She understood in the end. She did the right thing. It was hard, but family comes first. The narrative was already writing itself. Here's the strange thing. As I positioned the pen over the paper, I didn't feel defeated. I felt clear. Clear about who they thought I was. Clear about what they expected. Clear about how much certainty they were placing in a gesture they hadn't bothered to fully understand. I glanced at my mother one last time. Just a brief look. Some small, stubborn part of me waited, irrationally, quietly, for her to say something different. To interrupt. to ask a real question, to choose me over the image of harmony. She didn't. She looked away. That was it. The last thread snapped, not violently, not dramatically, just clean. I lowered the pen and signed. Ink flowed smoothly across the page. My hand didn't shake. My signature looked exactly the way it always did, consistent, practiced, legible. No hesitation, no flourish. When I finished, I placed the pen down carefully, parallel to the edge of the table. A small detail, intentional. Silence followed. Not the tense silence from before. This one was satisfied. My father nodded once, almost imperceptibly, like a man checking something off a list. My mother pressed her lips together, blinking faster than usual. Relief, not tears. Someone let out a breath they'd been holding. The room settled. From the outside, it looked like surrender. It looked like the story had ended exactly where it was supposed to. Here's a bleakly funny truth. If this were a movie, this is where the audience would start yelling at the screen. Don't do it! Why would you sign? After everything? I understand that reaction now. But what they couldn't see, what no one at that table could see, was that I wasn't signing the story they thought they'd written. I wasn't agreeing. I wasn't conceding. I was closing a door. Inside, something very old finally went quiet. The constant hum of obligation, the reflexive urge to explain myself, the internal negotiation of how much I could give without disappearing. It stopped. My father gathered the papers, already stacking them neatly. "We'll take care of the rest," he said. Of course he would. He didn't look at me again. My brother finally glanced up, eyes flicking toward me for a brief moment. There was something there. Guilt, maybe. Or fear. Or recognition. I didn't offer reassurance. That wasn't my role anymore. As people began to stand, chairs scraping softly against the floor, conversation returned in fragments. Small talk reassembled itself awkwardly, like furniture pushed back into place after a quiet earthquake. Someone commented on the cold outside. Someone else mentioned traffic. Life, apparently, was resuming. I sat there for a moment longer than necessary, hands folded, posture calm. On the surface, nothing had changed. Underneath, everything had. Because what they saw as my compliance was actually my confirmation. Confirmation of the pattern. Confirmation of the limits of their concern. Confirmation that the role I'd been assigned had finally reached its breaking point. They thought the signature meant I was trapped. They were wrong. It meant I was done pretending not to see the structure I'd been standing in all along. As I stood up from the table, I felt lighter. Not relieved, not happy. Resolved. They believed they had won. They believed the cost had been successfully transferred. They believed the story was over. It wasn't. It was just about to change perspective. And they had no idea what that signature actually meant. People often ask me if that night destroyed my family. It didn't. What it destroyed was the illusion that silence equals love. In the weeks that followed, nothing exploded the way movies promise. There was no dramatic apology, no sudden insight. Just distance, awkwardness, a quiet reshuffling of roles now that one of them no longer fit. And that was enough. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't managing anyone else's comfort. I wasn't translating tension into politeness or swallowing truth to keep the peace. I was just living, uneventfully, safely, on my own terms. Healing didn't arrive as forgiveness. It arrived as clarity. Clarity that choosing yourself doesn't make you cruel. Clarity that love, which requires self-erasure, isn't love. It's control with good manners. Clarity that walking away from a role doesn't mean abandoning who you are. If this story felt uncomfortably familiar, if you've ever been the strong one, the reasonable one, the one expected to carry what others drop, then you're not alone. And you're not wrong for wanting more. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories that name what's usually left unspoken, subscribe to the channel. Stay with me. We're just getting started. And sometimes, the most radical thing you can do is stop signing.